Hi, I'm Brian Scroggins, and this is a story of my battle with cancer. Back in the fall of 2018, I'd been having trouble with anxiety and fatigue at work. I was feeling just really tired and unable to hardly get up and go do my job. I also had some random abdominal pains that I was going through. But in September, those pains began to intensify, and one night I went to the ER thinking that I was going to pass a kidney stone. It was that kind of pain. The following morning, they did exploratory surgery on me, and it was determined at that time that my small intestines were dying, a condition called ischemic bowel. At that time, the doctors gave my family and my wife some pretty grave news. The ischemic bowel, he said, would be fatal. To make things worse, it was caused as a complication from acute myeloid leukemia. Both the leukemia and the ischemic bowel were death sentences. I'd love to tell you that I immediately shrugged it off and that fear never entered my mind, but the truth is, for several days I was on a ventilator, and then as the sedation began to wear off, the realization that a death sentence had been pronounced over me came flooding in. I'm so thankful at that time in the battle that while I was not even engaged in the battle for my life, that my wife and my children and a group of intercessors here at the Roads had already begun pulling down heaven for me. The first miracle occurred for me when those intercessors brought the need here to the Roads on a Wednesday night that I needed blood circulation returned back to my small intestines. And this church prayed, and when they did, God heard from heaven, and ischemic bowel bowed to the power of prayer that night, and to the doctor's surprise, I lived. As soon as I was stabilized, they transferred me to MD Anderson in Houston, Texas. When we arrived at MD Anderson, we were really encouraged to find out that the doctors and the staff there actually prayed over me daily. The nurses in my room even would come in, and anytime good news would come to us, they would actually stop what they were doing long enough to give God praise. And it was then that we realized that God's goodness had followed us to Houston. We felt a little isolated being so far from home to begin with down in Houston. That's when our prayer team here decided to try out a new plan to minister to us via text. And they invited us to share our needs as they arose 24/7. And soon we were receiving love and encouragement and prayer real time as the problems came at us, and they came often. And it was such a blessing to know that even when I was too sick to pray myself, that we could just text out a message of what was happening, and instantaneously faith was being applied to that situation. At the same time, back at home, lots of things were taking place. Little children in classrooms began singing songs over me and praying over me daily and sending videos to encourage us. Old friends from past mission trips sent words of encouragement to let us know that their communities and their churches and their families were praying for us. The people that I work with and the people in my hometown all were engaged in prayer at an incredible level. Financial gifts began to come in, and pretty quickly the expense of living far from home was overcome. Some people even got pretty creative and pooled their credit card points from their travel cards to pay for our motel accommodations, and they didn't just pay for them. They called down to Houston and they made the reservations for us. So at the time when I was so sick I could barely focus, I had all kinds of pain and nausea and sickness. I could just leave the hospital and I could go to a place that was already prepared for me. God was making a way for us, and He was using His people to do it, and we couldn't have been more thankful. Over the next few weeks, we were built up in our faith. We began to get kind of, when bad news would come to us, we'd automatically start shaking our head because we saw that God was working on our behalf. But just because God was working for us does not mean the attack of the enemy did not come. I was septic 4 different times with MRSA circulating in my bloodstream and E. coli circulating in my bloodstream, resistant strains that antibiotics were having a very difficult time to keep up with. I contracted fungal pneumonia. Fungal pneumonia is what 70% of AML patients die from. I was taking 6-hour per day infusions every day for weeks and weeks on end, and the infusions would make me so sick and so nauseous. All of those were attacks of the enemy that were designed to take me out, but according to the Word, no weapon that he formed against me was able to prosper. The battle being waged in my mind was probably the most difficult obstacle. I can remember one night, a particularly dark time, whenever my fears were really overcoming my faith, and thoughts about death and dying and just giving up were so strong. I was weak and I was sick, and thoughts about just giving up were just rolling in my head. And my wife was just as tired as I was, but she was unable to leave me in that dark place. And I can remember that night we We turned everything else off in the motel room. And nightly we'd play praise and music, but this night in particular, neither of us could sleep. And instead of just listening to praise and worship, we spent the whole evening just praising God. And we were exhausted, but in the middle of the night, we took Post-it notes and we began to write the Psalms out on the Post-it notes. And when we would fill a Post-it note up, we would stick it on the wall. And before the morning came, the walls and the furniture and the door and the mirror in the bathroom and the whole room was covered in Post-it notes, and we just fell asleep in exhaustion. And when we woke up the next morning, I woke up to breakthrough. The words that were written on the walls were written fresh in my heart. I'm just so thankful that God created that sanctuary for me. My oncologist said that fighting cancer would be like climbing a mountain. He said that the longer you climb, the more tired you get. And the closer you get to the end of your treatments will be your physical lowest point. By the time you get there, you're going to be worn out, you're going to be sick, and you're going to be just at your worst point. In the middle of my treatments, not at the end, some things that kind of stunned the doctors began to happen. My hair began to grow back in, and I was still taking a pretty strong dose of chemotherapy. And then I was on a liquid diet. My digestion was still not working from the ischemic bowel. It was still struggling a little bit, so I was only allowed to have liquids, and I'd already lost like 30% of my body weight. But I began to put weight back on. After only 2 rounds of chemotherapy, leukemia disappeared from my blood work. Then it disappeared from my bone marrow, and finally it disappeared from my PET scan. And although my doctors were unwilling to confirm it, by every measurement, I was already cancer-free. It's only been a couple of months since my treatments were over, but that time feels almost like a distant past to me. Today, I'm back at work in the job that I've had for 34 years. That job was held for me for a full year while I was off. When I returned, God set it up, and it could only be God, but I returned as if nothing had ever happened. My job was fully reinstated. Barbers too, we were both off for almost a full year. The insurance bills that we rang up during the time that all this was going on were $2 million worth. All of those were paid in full. There was one bill that hung over our head for quite a long time that had us kind of worried. It was the Life Flight bill. When we flew from Evansville to Houston, that bill was $103,000. When we implied about it, they told us that we would probably be making payments on it for the rest of our life. That was a pretty good concern. At 53, I didn't know how I was going to recoup $103,000. After the insurance company refused to pay it, and after the bill had been hanging out there for several months, I brought the paperwork in with me on Sunday morning to our prayer team. We prayed over that bill that day, and before I left, 2 people in our group come and prophesied over me and said, this bill is going to be taken care of in full. And although the bill was several months old and no movement had happened, prophesied on Sunday that it would be paid for. On Wednesday, the insurance company mysteriously changed their mind and decided they would pay $27,000 worth of that bill. And Life Flight of Missouri decided that they would waive the remaining portion with no communication to us. I received a letter in the mail saying, bill paid in full. And I just want to testify to you that God's favor is better than money in the bank. I just want to thank all the people in my church and in our prayer team and really in the whole community who prayed with me at midnight and at 5 o'clock in the morning, who sent letters and words of encouragement via text and telephone calls. So many blessings that I can't even name all of them. But it's because of your prayer and because of your faith with ours and your generosity that God brought my family and I through this trial in our life, happy and well and blessed. I would just encourage anyone who's going through a trial, whether it's cancer or any type of sickness, drug addiction, whatever it is, to, at onset, at the earliest stage, as soon as the attack comes, to connect yourself with a group of intercessors, with people that know how to pray and know how to petition God for the miraculous, and then join them and put your total confidence and hope in our God. You can hope in Him, you can trust in Him. And I'm here today to tell you that He is a God that hears your prayers. And I'm here to testify that He is a God that still heals.